ritual continues, and we close out now the first third of the second quarter. Notice that there's a geometry that's operative here. The ancient way of understanding integration is through geometry. One of the Pythagorean sayings is, geometry is history. Geometry is history. Not as we would understand history. This is 2,500 years ago. Geometry is an integral sequencing structure. When geometry became formalized, the human mind became capable of an astronomical capability in comparison to what it had been before. The difference is the difference between the Academy of Plato or some such school in Athens and the entire city of Alexandria. The difference is that before geometry is formalized as a structure of education, teaching was dependent upon some teacher who really mastered the material. Without a Socrates, there wouldn't have been a Plato. Without a Plato, there wouldn't have been an academy. At the most, the Academy of Plato, with its groves, its gardens, had no more than 40, 50 young men at the most. But as soon as geometry became formalized as an integration sequence, you had tens of thousands of people being educated. So the broadcast value of having geometry as a sequencing background to learning was extraordinary. For us, what is important to keep in mind is that with geometry, you do not come into possession of the arts of differentiation. And one of the fundamental intellectual lessons that the late 20th century refuses to learn is that without developing the higher powers of trigonometric functions, differential processes are not looked at all as real. And without the differential analytical capacities, the human mind is easily led. Those who control the images, those who operate the subliminal structures, are able to operate with impunity, uncontested. The manipulative capacity of false leaders is augmented purposefully by the inculcation of limited image foundations in a population. And it does no good to have an intelligentsia who understand differential qualities. If you do not have a population that understands it, then you have a time bomb. Then you have Germany in 1933. Because it doesn't matter how sophisticated a culture is at its top end, if the population does not embody differential qualities in its ordinary life, they are sitting ducks and patsies for a really sophisticated tyrant to come along and mold them. And they are particularly susceptible to being molded in an archetypal pattern, the crunching fulcrum of which is the scapegoat phenomenon. And the time-honored doorway that enters into this particular devastating syndrome is through the women. Because women are archetypally the threshold by which a certain Bacchae comes into possession of men's lives. And it is through that Bacchae that men are molded, even against their better judgment, into tyrannical units. In the next section of the ritual, we will take the great archetypal presentation of this condition, the last great Greek tragedy written by Euripides, written in exile, the advanced age at that time of 70. And it was literally the last great Greek tragedy ever written. It's almost as Faulkner said, when you have written your heart out, you break the pencil, because there's nothing more that can be said. And Euripides' Bacchae perfects the form and purpose of ancient Greek tragedy. One might say perfects it to the nth degree. And while it was the last classical great Greek tragedy, it was the fount from which all Hellenistic, exotic, orgiastic cults were founded and broadcast on wide levels. Before the Bacchae, orgiastic cults were limited to certain seasons of certain years in certain geographical locations. After the Bacchae, the way was paved for persons who were less than conscientious about human freedom and the maturation of people. And they were broadcast so that they happened at any time, in any year, with any population of people. And as long as the ritualistic limitations were in effect, the kind of Dionysian event that happened was folded into a larger strata known as life. Because those orgiastic cult events were specifically inoculations against a plague that has two faces, a plague, one face of which is death and the other face of which is madness. And as long as one was inoculated by a little bit of this poison, it was understood that life was renewed in a form where we were impervious to the major plague outbreak. But what happened after the Bacchae was that the formula was seen of how to mass produce. And instead of inoculating people with a controlled virus, mass-produced psychological plague was loosed upon the world. And it ravaged the ancient world for 4 centuries and produced the exact opportunity of Jesus to bring that raging plague to an end. And the passion play of Jesus, as presented in the four Gospels is exactly a replay of the Dionysiac Passion Play, codified archetypally in the Bacchae. One can draw a direct ruler straight line from the Bacchae 404 BC to the crucifixion of Jesus in 36 AD. And in that 440 years, you have a development of civilization that has so haunted the psyche of modern man that the 20th century has been literally a replay of all of these Hellenistic, exotic, orgiastic cults, one of which was National Socialism in Germany. And so we're after very serious game here. We're hunting something which has bedeviled us. And even the word bedeviled shows us the true origins of this process. In order to balance out Euripides' Bacchae, I have paired it with the most classic of all of the disciplines in meditation. There are many meditations. There are many contemplative practices. There are many modes of concentration. There are many yogas. But there is one that is the archetypal ultimate, the ultimate form of a concentrated meditation to bring exactness into its true presence is the Mindfulness Sutra of the historical Buddha. It's called the Satipatthana Sutra. And in a way, there's a very interesting kind of quality here in the language, because the Patthana of the Buddha and the Pathe of Dionysius are linguistically cognate together. And in the next month, we'll come to understand in a very real way that the lack of traction in the 20th century is due to a broadcast flawed phenomena in human society, which matches perfectly with a neurotic gap in human character. And if the 20th century has demonstrated anything to intelligence, it's that this is a dead end that is here now. There is no way for society with this crack, nor for the human personality with this flaw, to go any farther. And so this is very serious material and very serious business. Too serious for a small room. But it's the only place that there is that can be used currently. Now I'd like to back off a little bit. Back off by putting a strategic set of situations before our attention. The Satipatthana Sutra of the Buddha is about 500 BC. Euripides' Bacchae is about 404 BC, 405, 404. They're about a century apart. The Satipatthana Sutra becomes available before Euripides' Bacchae. The Satipatthana Sutra of the Buddha would be contemporaneous with the early development, the early maturation of two great Greek figures. One of them was Aeschylus, who was the founder of Greek tragedy, and the other is Pindar, who was the greatest Greek lyric poet. The mind of Pindar, with its eagle-like capacity to swoop with unswerving insight to the exact spot where an eagle would pick up a fish out of a fast-flowing river, Pindar's language became one of the greatest vehicles in the world because it allowed for the personal expression in high dramatic lyric poetry for the first time in the world. It allowed for a personal language to describe exactly the moment by which freedom is obtained by grasping it and carrying it off. Whereas his paired twin in poetic great language, Aeschylus, developed Greek tragedy, which was the collective way of expressing the same thing. And it was said of Aeschylus that with his bald head, that very frequently in a crowd one would think that an eagle's egg was laying there in the population of people. A metaphorical way of speaking of the mind of Aeschylus. But Aeschylus's language is very famous for the same kind of pyrotechnic brilliance that Pindar's language is famous for. It is a presentation in the classical Greek language of a capacity never before seen. It happens with Pindar and Aeschylus together. At the same time, they're exact contemporaries, one in the lyric mode of the person, one in the collective mode of the drama. The relationship between the two is that in Greek tragedy, the fount of the dramatic activity is focused upon the lead character. And as long as the lead character is within the drama, you have a Greek tragedy. When the lead character is able to step outside the drama, off the stage, he becomes a lyrically free person. So that Pindar's poetry is the encapsulated core of Aeschylus's dramatic language. And when the individual is able to step outside of the archetypal dramatic forms that are forced upon us by our own natures, by the conditions which we can do very little about, but when a way is found for someone to step outside of that manipulative, propagandized form, one achieves personal, lyric freedom. Something unheard of in the ancient world. Something discovered poignantly at this particular time. And discovered not only in Greece at this time, but discovered in India at this very same time. In a way, the historical Buddha brings the qualities of Aeschylus and Pindar together in a woven composition. Each sutra is like Greek tragedy in that each sutra is a community form. Each sutra is always spoken to a population of people. It's never addressed to someone. It's always addressed, the formal way was simply to address them by way of ascertaining if they were ready to hear by saying monks. And the reply was a ritual reply, revered one. And then the ritual reply to that was the beginning of the sutra. So the Buddhist sutra, the classical sutra of the Buddha, is very much a social form of high language that focuses increasingly upon the uniqueness of the practitioner, the uniqueness of that someone who occupies a focus of the dramatic forces. And as the dramatic forces of the collective focus upon the individual is challenged with only three possibilities. You can die, you can go crazy, you can become enlightened. And increasingly, you are left with only those three possibilities. all others fold themselves in, because the integration becomes so intense through the heat, the pressure, the relentlessness, that you either will become a jewel or you will be crushed. And in becoming a jewel, you have a bifurcative capacity. You can be a flawed jewel, in which case you will be mad. Or you can be a perfected jewel, in which case you will shine and be free. The difficulty was that there was a double jeopardy. The first jeopardy was that you would die, death. But the second jeopardy, the hook in the whole process, that even if you lived, you probably would go crazy. And so you had every opportunity on every level to shy away from this process, to not do this. Because the probability of dying was very high, and even if you survived, the probability of madness was even higher. Why would you do it? And so wisdom traditions that poignantly lead to individual personal enlightenment and freedom are the most shunned of all human activities. They are, in fact, outlawed by codes and laws not to be practiced. We are taught not to do this. We are expected not to do this. We are encouraged not to do this. In subtle ways. And some not so subtle. We are told in our generation that only peculiar weirdo eggheads would ever want to do this sort of thing. Why would you want to go off by yourself and think when there's so much to do and so many to do it with? One is reminded of the great refrain that Fielding put into Tom Jones. Off they hurry to London, together or one by one, some to undo and others to be undone. In fact, the whole process of understanding, as Jung points out many times in his work, becomes emotionally identified with the process of being swallowed up. Because understanding is enlarging the context, and as you enlarge the context, the ritual comportment of society leaves the distinct impression you're going to be swallowed. That understanding, that precise knowing, is in fact giving oneself up to the gaping maw of very sharp teeth. And it is backed up by the archetypal impression that you could get killed doing this, and more subtly, more pernicious, you could go crazy doing this. And because of the various shams, false teachers, sheer stupidity, lack of talent, the ability to find someone who can do this for themselves is very rare, and to be able to pass this on to anyone else is rarer still. So that the historical Buddha, a very clear thinker, characterized this world as samsara. Not that this world is illusion, but that any attempt to free oneself within this world is tantamount to an illusory process. And so when he begins the Satipatthana Sutra, it begins this way. Notice the ritual. The very first beginning is always in the fairy tale form. The fairy tale form is that you begin a narrative once upon a time, and the emphasis is on once. In India, in the Magadhi language form of Sanskrit, it always began, thus have I heard. Once upon a time, thus have I heard. And the thus becomes so profound that the word in Tibetan, for instance, is ivam. An evam is a mantra equal to Om in the Vajrayana. One could meditate forever on the word evam, thus, as in thusness, as in suchness. Just as once can be recognized so deep, like in chaos theory, once you know the once, you have everything else. Because even if it were a random process, you could play it out. You could mathematically analyze its differential parameters and solve it to any degree of exactness. What this means is that our nature is not to be swallowed up by understanding, but to refine it to the exactest point that we would ever desire. We're made to know. In the Satipatthana Sutra, which incidentally occurs in collections, when the historical Buddha died, his remembered sermons were collected according to size. The really large ones were collected together, and they called it a Nikaya, a basket. And so the Dika Nikaya was the basket of large sutras, about 35 of them. Then there were really short ones, and there were so many short ones that they made 3 different collections of them and put them together. But the middle-length ones are the ones that are my favorites. They're called the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length sayings of the Buddha. And they're collected in 3 volumes. And each of the 3 volumes has 50. So there are 3 50s. And then there's 1 extra, because on the high Dharma, one doesn't make a circle that's complete. One always leaves a little bit of a nib so that you can pull the form free, like a spirit trail on a Navajo rug. So there are 151 middle-length sayings of the Buddha. And the 50s, the 3 50s, are arranged in 5 groups of 10, because there's something archetypal in the sequence of the 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And so the 5 for 5 fingers, for 5-phase energy cycle, for 5ness, the 5 10s making a 50. Notice that the Jewish Jubilee, the 50, 7 times 7 plus 1. The 50 is like a cycle of harvest. In fact, the great understanding in classical Judaism was that you had 7 50s during an annual year, and each 50 had its own harvest. And that 50th day was a first fruit day. And so 7 times during the year, you would have, on the 50th day, a harvest and a celebration of first fruits. The first fruits of the wine, the first fruits of the grain, the first fruits of the oil, and so forth. And the 7th festival of first fruits was the Feast of Tabernacles, the one that Jesus preferred. In the 50s of the historical Buddha, directly related to the same archetypal structure, the 10s were the way by which one counted, in terms of nodes of experience, your maturity towards the harvest. So that the first 10 were the most important of all the sutras. And the first 10 of the Majjhima Nikaya are a template by which the superior person can grasp the entirety of the matrix of integration. All of Buddhism, all of it, the entire structure is here in these first 10 sutras. And in fact, the first sutra of the Majjhima Nikaya is called the Mula Pariyaya Sutra, the discourse on the synopsis of fundamentals. The discourse on the short form, the synopsis of the fundamentals. And the 10th sutra is the Mindfulness Sutra, the Satipatthana. And so the 10th of The first 10 is the Satipatthana Sutra in the Majjhima Nikaya. Begins thus, have I heard. At one time the Lord was staying among the Kuru people in a township of the Kurus called Kamasadama. While he was there, the Lord addressed the monks, saying, Monks, revered one, there is this one way for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrows and griefs, for the going down of sufferings and miseries, for winning the right path, for realizing nirvana. That is to say, the 4 applications of mindfulness. What are the 4? And so that's how it began. Now the term in Sanskrit, patthana, has a double meaning. Its visceral meaning is arousal, arousing, patthana. But the arousing, by its own nature, gives over to a quality which we would call application. Application. Distinct from projection. Distinct from projection. If you get aroused, if something is aroused in you, if I get angry about something, and I simply transfer the anger to a cup, I'll break the cup. If I apply the anger instead of transferring it, I might just turn the cup 180 degrees. If I have the arousal of kindness, I might want to hug something. If I apply that rather than just transfer that, the application of it, I might send out a loving thought to all the world. The application, the patthana, is the arousing which becomes applied. So that there is a primal, gut level, a visceral root to patthana, which flowers in an application which includes consciousness, conscientiousness, which denotes that there is in the movement a turn which takes primalness, visceralness, and gives it a structuring, because application always has a structure to it. So not only is there a patthana, but there is a 4-fold patthana. So that the visceral is that one is aroused to do something, and the application of it is that you do it in a 4-fold nature. The basic 4-fold nature, incidentally, are the 4 Noble Truths. The same thing in Greek tragedy. The very same thing in the theater of Dionysus. Dionysus is the patron god of drama. The best edition of the Bacchae ever done was this, done by famous man E.R. Dodds, Regius Professor of Greek in the University of Oxford, published by Oxford University Press, 1960. Dodds had done tremendous research in the 1940s, and in 1950 had written a book which was published, 1951, published by the University of California Press. They were the Sather Classical Lectures for 1950. At the University of California, Berkeley, the Sather family made a lot of money available. The main gate into Berkeley's campus is the Sather Gate. And the Sather classical lectures are one of the great classical lecture series in the world. And Dodds, at mid-century, gave the Sather classical lectures on the Greeks and the irrational. Everyone knows about the rationality of the Greeks. What about the irrational? Because the Greeks were as attentive to the irrational as a few were to the rational. Let's face it, Plato's were rare. There was only one. But there were millions of Greeks who paid homage every day to the irrational. Even Plato pays homage to the irrational throughout the dialogues. So Dodds understood the Greeks and the irrational, and when he finished that, the next 10 years it sat with him, and he did this beautiful edition of the Bacchae, which is the best edition ever done of the Bacchae. Unfortunately, it's in Greek with just a few notes in English, but we can make use of it. The translation of the Bacchae I'm going to use is Michael Kakionis. Kakionis is a wonderful filmmaker. Did he not make Zorba the Greek? So he understands cinematographic dramatic action, and his translation of the Bacchae, which was made here in 1982, is exceedingly refined. The Buddha's Satipatthana Sutra brings together, codified in the word patthana, the double action of arousal and application. The greatest fiction in the West is that meditation is a calming down. That somehow you get anesthetized and therefore you're good. Anyone who's anesthetized is going to be good. They're going to really behave. They're going to be very sweet. But you can't keep them under. Well, you can, but it's time consuming. And so what happens with Westerners who take this fictive view of meditation is that while they're in the zendos, while they're on the weekend retreats, they're very nice, and when they're driving home, they're yelling at everybody on the freeway. And they take it out on their children, and on their wives, and on their workers, and they become holy terrors. Because as soon as you go inside, the very first thing you meet is the negative. As Jung says, therapy is a very thing to undergo, because the first person to show up is the mask of the shadow. It says, "Whoa, you're trying to get rid of me, huh? We'll see about that." Faust asks Mephistopheles in Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, "Why does the devil want our soul so much anyway?" And Mephistopheles, curling one of his mustaches, says, "Misery loves company." And so we include others in our shadow very easily. They're at least as guilty as we are, though we will not admit it. Euripides' Bacchae poignantly brings out, like the Buddha in the Satipatthana Sutra, that an arousal takes place, and the arousal must be turned to application. You must have the arousal, and it must be turned to application. You cannot allow a transference, because the transference simply takes the hit and hits someone else. You have to be able to take the hit on this cheek and let the other cheek be turned. This is the whole poignancy of Jesus' Satyagraha. If you do not transfer, then the energy will transform. If you do not become an unwitting accomplice, then you become a witting unaccomplice. Got it straight. And when someone becomes a witting unaccomplice, you gain your freedom and you gain your wit. As Ben Jonson wrote in the first folio of Shakespeare, he wrote as a preface to Troilus and Cressida, he said, "Dear reader, you may find herein more grain to grind upon." It's a quality that is there in Euripides, Bacchae, poignantly, because Euripides brings together two qualities that at first do not seem to go together, but after a while one sees that they not only go together, they belong together. The Pathe of Dionysius and the Bacchae of the wild women of the Bacchae. The orgiastic women go with the pathos of Dionysus. They go together. They're completely honed together. One of them is a midwinter ceremony, the other is a spring ceremony. They go together just like Christmas and Easter go together, because that was the program that made Christmas and Easter in the first place. Birth and death or transfiguration. And what's almost not talked about is that death being overcome is only the first and the lesser of the mysteries. The higher and greater of the mysteries to overcome is madness. Women will fear death first, but men fear madness most. And it is extremely important in the wisdom tradition to get that straight and to deal with it precisely. And Euripides and the Buddha together share a comprehensive dealing with this entire scenario. It is the archetypal scenario of ritual. The Satipatthana Sutra concerns itself with getting ritual action down to the present. Its theme is bare attention. To not only know what is happening, but to know that you're knowing what's happening. So that the precision comes down, so that the occurrence of the multiplicity resolves to one thing. The Buddha says, there is this one way. The razor's edge. One of the peculiarities of a razor's edge is that you cannot slide along it. You have to maintain an exact tip-toe stillness in order to be there on the razor's edge. And this is the ultimate precariousness and peril. The 4 applications of mindfulness were made famous in the Buddhist world by the Buddha. But of course, over millennia, they became scrambled and desecrated just like anything else. And they were restated in about 300 years ago by the 7th Dalai Lama. And I'll bring out a translation from the 7th Dalai Lama called The 4 Applications of Mindfulness, and let you see. Just as Euripides' Bacchae received fantastic attention in the 20th century, and especially towards the latter third of the 20th century, not only Kakayana's great translation of the Bacchae, but in Africa, the great Nobel Prize winner from Nigeria, Wale Soyinka, translated the Bacchae of Euripides. because late 20th century Nigeria, especially in places like Lagos, are evident examples of societies that are being chewed up, mauled by this very archetype, by people who are either dying or dead, dominated by the living who are insane. And so you have madmen persecuting zombies. This is the very image of hell. And this is exactly what makes the Bacchae and the Satipatthana Sutra ultimately religious. Aldous Huxley, in Ends and Means, wrote, "Ritual dances provide a religious experience that seems more satisfying and convincing than any other. It is with their muscles that they most easily obtain knowledge of the divine." And so we will see that there is, at the very core of ritual, a paradox. One is going to move to the still presence on the razor's edge, but one does it by orgiastic movement. This is a paradox. We say c'est la vie, can we say c'est la machine? Let's take a break. Let's come back to this very interesting. We're not being offered a comparison. We're not being offered a comparison of the Buddha and Euripides, of India and Greece. We're not being offered that. It's not a comparison. It's a pair. It's not compare. It's paired. This pair is part of the strategic structure by which this education moves. The movement of this education is on two legs rather than on single pivots. So instead of being more and more stuck to a viewpoint which one then has to reinforce and defend in order to have certainty, which produces kinds of personality that are very effective in the current world and do absolutely nothing in reality, are part of samsara. Nothing's happening. This kind of education produces the quality of mobility which an individual would need either to operate individually or to come together with other individuals and form real communities that actually, when they do something, something gets done. And so effective action for the individual or for the community are the twin paired functions of this educational strategy. So while it seems to be an interesting version of education, it's actually the only real educational procedure that there is. This is the classic restatement for the 21st century of what has always been the way in which wise men and women have learned, have taught, have continued life in a very high way. The 7th Dalai Lama, Keisang Gyatso, the contemporary Dalai Lama's name Tenzin Gyatso, Keisang Gyatso, wrote around 1750, about the time, late 1750s, about the time that Benjamin Franklin's book on electricity was being published by Peter Collins in London, about that same time. The four mindfulnesses, mindfulness of the teacher, on the seat of the immutable union of method and wisdom. The immutable union of method and wisdom sits the kind teacher who is the entity of all the refuges. The second mindfulness, the mindfulness of the translation here is altruistic aspiration to highest enlightenment. Now that phrase, altruistic aspiration, would be very meaningful if one was cognizant of Petrim Sorokin and his deep socio-philosophical understanding of altruism, but it's usually not available for the refined thought intelligence of people. A better translation here, the mindfulness of the selfless commitment to. Selfless commitment to. It's not that so much that you're determined to do it at all costs, but it's that you do it understanding the costs. The former is a kind of a John Wayne doggedness, and the latter is the kind of courage that makes life possible. I don't denigrate the Duke, but I'm just pointing out here that there is a difference here. It's like the difference between somebody who thinks that the American ideal was the frontiersman rather than the man ready for the frontier. If you think that the ideal was the frontiersman, then wearing your blue jean dungarees and puffing your Marlboro cigarette in Tokyo, that you're a Western individualist, and that's not it at all. It's not the frontiersman, which can be covered by images. It's the man ready for the frontier, which is the guy putting his hideout on the line on the moon. I know it's a trite aside, but there have only been Americans on the moon. Why is that so? Because it takes a real trans-lunar personality to go there and operate. And despite some of the oddities, like Joseph Campbell pointing out that they're using a 4,000-year-old cosmology to read us Christmas messages from lunar orbit, despite that, a lot of Americans actually went to the moon and hung their hinds out there. That is psychologically a really perilous position. And it was summed up archetypally by Harrison Schmitt, who had the first archetypal dream on the moon. He dreamed that he with his buddy were driving the lunar rover, and they drove it over several ridges out of sight of the lunar module, out of sight of the lens, so that they were out of sight of land, out of sight of any human referent for the very first time in all of our species' history. And in the dream, when they drove the lunar rover out of sight of humanity's land, out onto the ocean of open unknownness, in his dream, he saw another lunar rover being driven by two astronauts coming to meet them. And in the dream, he met himself and his buddy driving another lunar rover, and they met out there in the mirrored nothingness of the moon. And that actually happened in 1972. And nobody's been to the moon since, because that was as far as it could go. And until there's a major personality change concomitant with a structural change in society, nobody's going to the moon, much less Mars or all the wonderful other planets and other star systems anywhere. So that the second mindfulness pointed out by the seventh Dalai Lama 300 years ago, still holds. In the prison of the suffering of limitless cyclic existence wander the 6 types of sentient beings, bereft of happiness. Because once you exhaust the energy inherent in a form, the form is finished. You have to have a new form with new energy, new wine in new wineskins, or nothing happens. So the third mindfulness is mindfulness of your body as a divine body. And the fourth mindfulness is mindfulness of the view of emptiness. As a friend of mine once said, when you get to the top of the maypole of archetypal achievement and accomplishment, you can look back down the core of the inside of the pole, and you can see the zero base. A view of emptiness. And it's empty precisely because it's open to receive the new forms with the new wine. And without that, the invitation to an unknown, newly created life would be a sucker battle, and not the promise of freedom. And it is indeed the promise of freedom. Mindfulness of your body as a divine body. And in classic Buddhism, there are 3 bodies. There's the Dharmakaya, the Nirmanakaya, the Sambhogakaya. The Dharmakaya is the body of wisdom, Dharma. The Nirmanakaya is the body of formedness. The Sambhogakaya is the body of enjoyment. The enjoyment arouses and turns itself into language. The wisdom body, the Dharmakaya, has no need of language whatsoever. It's at home in the zero-based nature. It doesn't have to say anything. The Nirmanakaya, that physical body, is temporal, it's episodic. It lives out its form and then it can say no more. But the transition, the fulcrum, is on the Sambhogakaya, the body of enjoyment, which speaks. Just for edification, in the Nirmanakaya, the Bodhisattva is Avalokiteshvara, who looks back down the core of the maypole to the zero base with compassion and mercy. The Bodhisattva for Dharmakaya is Manjushri, who holds the flaming double-edged sword of wisdom, doesn't need to say a thing. The Bodhisattva for Sambhogakaya is Samantabhadra, the Bodhisattva of love, who thrives on the arousal and dances it into speech, into the application, the spontaneous speech of creative life. The body in love sings. It's as simple as that. This fourfold mindfulness, the 4 applications of mindfulness of the 7th Dalai Lama, comes 2250 years after the Buddha made it very clear in the Satipatthana Sutra. In memory of the death of Richard Nixon, he made it perfectly clear. One of Nixon's famous ways of speaking misunderstood by many people. Nixon was raised in a Quaker background and had a predilection for quiet, exacting contemplation from the Quaker tradition, which made it very difficult for him personally to deal with other people on the deepest levels. And he was used to dealing with people in a delegated authority way, which made him formidable in politics, but didn't bring the deeper personal RMN into play very often. The historical Buddha made it perfectly clear. And in doing so, he used this kind of language. And here's the translation. These were written down right after the Buddha's, they don't call it death because he didn't die. They don't call it craziness because he didn't go mad. They call it parinirvana. He told it in this kind of language, instead of specifying them, like the 7th Dalai Lama, the historical Buddha, using the kind of high language that Pindar and Aeschylus would have used, and Euripides brought it to poignant, dramatic perfection in the Bacchae. He spoke this way. One fares along, contemplating the body in the body, clearly conscious of it, mindful of it, so as to control covetousness and dejection, the plus and minus. Covetousness, oh, what a nice body. Dejection, what a crummy body. Notice that covetousness and dejection, Buddha characterizes this plus and minus, which are very close to the zero base, neutral thread, which has no taste, no tone, no electrical charge whatsoever. The word sutra means thread. It means following the neutral thread all the way through the discourse. And the only way one can follow it is to be open completely and let the thread of the discourse go through your openness all the time. It's called threading the eye of the needle, and it's what Jesus meant by the saying, it's very difficult for a rich man to attain the kingdom. It's as difficult as a camel riding through the eye of a needle. Contemplating the body in the body, clearly conscious of it, mindful of it, so as to control covetousness and dejection in the world, he fares along, contemplating the feelings, in the feelings, ardent, clearly conscious, mindful so as to control covetousness and dejection. Notice now that there was covetousness and dejection in the body. There's also covetousness and dejection in the feelings. One has come not full circle, but like in a spiral, one has come to a higher level. You're contemplating the body in the body. Now you're contemplating feelings in the feelings. This is a mindfulness sutra. Paying attention, bear attention. All right, you're first attentive to the fact that you're in your body. Don't lie about it. You're here. This is your body. In that body, in the circling of that body, what gets aroused is the feeling dimension. That feeling dimension arouses, and notice here, the method is archetypal because the arousal is given an application. The arousal of mindfulness in the body is applied in such a way that the feelings emerge clearly as now the new place where one is. And so the feelings are going to have their arousal turned to an application, and one is going to be somewhere on the next higher turn. Just as the feelings are within the body, what is inside of the feelings? clearly conscious, mindful, so as to control covetousness and dejection in the world, he fares along contemplating the mind. The body, feelings, the mind. And what's inside the mind? The Buddha was very simple about it. Mental objects is the translation. Mental objects. One contemplates the body in the body as the body. And the contemplation can be as long as you want, and you can go into as much detail. The classic version of the Satipatthana Sutra includes the consciousness of the fingernails, the consciousness of the edge of the fingernails, consciousness of the nostrils, of the breath coming in and out of the nostrils, of the rim of the left nostril, of the hair in the left nostril vibrating. One can go in as much detail as you need to complete the cycle of the body, of being mindful about your body. And when that is fulfilled, when that's full, when the contemplation of the body is full, without even needing to, wanting to, the feelings occur exactly pristinely there. It's like a universal truth. When an energy level is completely full, it's just like water that's being introduced into a container. And when this level of the water is full, it spills over into the next level. And one allows for the spilling over to happen, not just in a transferal way. Because if it happened in a transferal way, what happens is that the impress of the former stamps the new thing with its own quality. And instead of experiencing feelings, qua feelings, you experience feelings in terms of the body. And when you experience feelings in terms of the body predisposes you in a bodily way, and you misunderstand feelings qua feelings. And while that's serious enough, when you get to the mind, you understand not the mind in terms of the mind, but you understand the mind in terms of feelings that are already prejudiced in terms of the body. And you get stupid statements like people saying that when you see within, you see these beautiful forms of this or that. Any accomplished meditator would give them an F and fail them. Go back to the beginning. Do not collect $200. Try it again. Because when you see the mind as mind, you don't see. What do you see? The term mental objects is kind of a peculiar way of misunderstanding this. Because when you look to see mental objects within mental objects, they do not exist. And so the Buddha in the Satipatthana Sutra says, one fares along contemplating the mental objects in the mental objects, and herein one who is forest gone to the root of a tree, or gone to an empty place, sits down cross-legged, holding his back erect, arousing mindfulness in front of him. Mindful, he breathes in. Mindful, he breathes out. Long, contemplates long breaths. Short, contemplates short breaths. He trains himself thinking, I shall breathe in, experiencing the whole body. He trains himself thinking, I shall breathe out, experiencing the whole body. He trains himself thinking, I shall breathe in, tranquilizing the activity of the body. I shall breathe out, tranquilizing the activity of the body. Thus, 4 jhanas arise: body, feeling, mind, mental objects. body, feelings, mind, mental objects. Notice we have an asterisk on mental objects. We have a little check mark there. Body, feeling, mind, mental objects. Ritual, myth, symbol, used to be called magic. We're calling it vision now, in deference to Chaucer. Chaucer's age and his English introduced the term vision. The dream vision of the 14th century was one of the great, tremendous expressive leaps forward. Before Chaucer, English poetry is about rip-roaring heroes like Beowulf, and Chaucer's, the English is about, as he says, a fair field full of folk. Human character gets resolved in Chaucer's language, so that one comes to know people as they are in their character. That's what the Canterbury Tales is all about, getting to know who you're journeying with in life. Not just types, but personality. Chaucer's English is refined enough to resolve human character in its fullness. It's an epical advance in language. It's like Plato's Greek. For the first time in Plato's Greek, you can resolve human character in that medium. Before that, you had dramatic personages, but you didn't have someone. The first someone that is refined in the Greek language is Socrates. It is Plato's portrait of Socrates' character that makes the dialogues indelible as a civilizing phenomenon. It is the Chaucerian person that makes possible the wonderful dramatic action of characters in Shakespeare's language. This is the way civilization happens, not because of wars and not because of kings. They're toys. The Buddha shows that body, ritual has to do with the body. Feelings, language, myth. Ritual flames into myth. The body of enjoyment speaks. And when that occurs, the mind is possible. And when the mind is possible, quote, mental objects are provisionally possible, but actually do not hold their presence. All mental objects, when looked at as mental objects, disappear. Why? Because they are not, on the most simple level, memorable. Not that they're not important and thus not memorable, but that strategically the structure of them has no mnemonic energy whatsoever. They do not occur. And so what occurs is an openness. One recognizes that there's only recognition, but nothing to recognize. So the Buddha says, in just this way, someone will fare along contemplating the body in the body, internally, externally together, contemplating the origin of things in the body, the dissolution of things in the body, the origination, dissolution in the body, or thinking this is body. His mindfulness becoming established precisely to the extent necessary just for knowledge, just for remembrance. And he fares along independently, not grasping anything in the world. And one can do this while walking, one can do this while standing still, one can do this while lying down, one can do this while sitting. It can be walking, one can be standing still, one can be sitting, one can be lying down. Notice that fours keep occurring in here. That there are 4 cycles that go to a vanishing point. The body, feelings, mind, mental objects, open. Lying down, sitting, standing still, walking. 4s occur all the way through. I'm going to skip through to the end of the Satipatthana Sutra. The way in which the application of this fourfoldness is made by the Buddha in the Satipatthana Sutra of the 4 Noble Truths. The 4 Noble Truths are the application of the contemplation, which has fulfilled itself by being in the body as the body, being in the feelings as feelings, being in the mind as mind, and being in the mental objects as mental objects, which is to say, empty. The view of that they're empty. Were it not for the fact, it is a fact, were it not for the fact that mental objects disappear when looked at without the base of the mind to support them. They need the base of the mind as a substratum in order for them to continue their provisional existence. They do not have existence in and of themselves. While the mind does, the feelings do, the body does, mental objects don't. And because mental objects do not have independent existence, if one cuts off the substratum of the mind feeding them energy, they don't occur. It's not that they die, it's not that they wilt, they vanish. So there is such a thing as a clear mind, an open mind. Now we talk a lot about, and it was a phrase used after the Second World War in all the conferences of general education, trying to figure out how to prevent a Third World War from destroying civilization. One of the reoccurring phrases used at Harvard, at Columbia, everywhere that intelligent men and women gathered together, the phrase used was that we need individuals with open minds. But the only guarantee that this is not going to happen again on an even worse catastrophic level is that we have to educate a population of people who are individual and have open minds. It was not done. And the inertia, the massive inertia of Western civilization was enough to carry 2 generations of people through. It's not enough to carry a 3rd generation through. It's all finished. It's done. The engine's out of gas, the tires are flat, the gears are shot, and there's nowhere to coast much longer. You have to get out of the vehicle and start walking to make some kind of new life. There's no alternative whatsoever. It's not apocalyptic talk. It's just the specs on the sheet. It's the mechanic reading off the fact that has already happened. It's just descriptive. The 4 applications. Notice here that the application is what makes the arousal wise. Passion, which is applied, becomes compassion. Passion, with wisdom in its application, becomes compassion. And true education creates the conditions in which compassion spontaneously arises in the student. And when the students experience on their own, without anyone forcing it, without anyone inculcating it, without anyone subliminally teasing it out, putting it there, There's a million ways to speak about this. When it spontaneously happens, they each know it's true. And they each know it's true of each other, and that's the opportunity that allows for people to come together in real communities. Because when you have individuals with truly open minds, on this technical level, then communities actually happen where one has human forms that are based not on political coerciveness, but upon the Greek term was arete, upon the virtue of the humanity. When human beings come together, in terms of their humanity, whatever size, levels, organizations, those are live groups, those are live populations. And their activities are real in this world, not illusion, not in samsara. And those activities of individuals brought together are what technically were called in Plato's day democracies. And there never has been a democracy that wasn't a spiritual achievement. The idea that there are democracies which are political achievements is a fiction and has nothing to do whatsoever with workability. That's the kind of bravado of an Andrew Jackson who rode his horse into the front door of the White House and said, "Get rid of this Jeffersonian furniture. I gotta have a place to put my boots up." And it sounded real good. And in 30 years we had the Civil War. There's no substitute for intelligence and for someone knowing what to do. What we're doing in ritual now is we're coming to this use of ritual activity with an intelligent eye towards being real in it, which leads to a juxtaposition which is irrefutable. Irrefutable. What comes out of this is the poignancy of discovering, of uncovering, discovering in your own experience the fact that when you, as you, really do something, it gets done. This is the final confidence that is necessary for life. You have to not only believe, you have to know that when you're doing this in the right way, it's done. It happened. And you can count on the fact that it was done, that it happened, and stand on that achievement and go further. If you cannot, you get lost in the endless morass of skepticism, of doubt, and eventually of convicting yourself of nihilistic subterranean beliefs. And man, in a natural, untransformed state, always gets caught in those dead ends. And that's why Dionysus comes along and destroys the forms through the women. Because those were dead ends, and if people stay in those forms, they will die. They will suffocate. So the forms have to be broken. The pathe of it, the pathos of it, is that they must go. The Bacchic quality is that the women dissolve those old forms, for their final allegiance is not to the forms, but to life. Not life at any cost, but life at the real cost. And the real cost is to give up the dead forms. Thomas Jefferson wrote that there was a term in law which, in a very specific way, it's called usufruct. The term means that the final recourse of law is that the earth belongs to the living. No matter how great the dead were, the earth belongs to the living. We have the right to amend and change where we need, irregardless of the past wisdoms and their viability and their grandness and their importance. The earth belongs to the living. And a Jeffersonian revolution in government, his calculation was that every 19 years, every generation, all the forms should be voluntarily dissolved, and that new generation make whatever forms they need provisionally to keep the activities that they deem important operative, and to let all the other ones subside, and to especially put the kicker in that 19 years in the future, a next generation will be able to dissolve their forms just as well. All of that got sidetracked by the birth of political parties in Jacksonian America. It happened in southern Michigan, nice little town in southern Michigan, where political parties were really born. It was a revival of the Federalist ideal in terms of the new exigencies of having to make it look good in Jeffersonian America. We're going to come back next week and take a look at the Bacchae. I would like you to read, in any translation that you can get, the first 5 pages of the Bacchae. At the very beginning, Dionysus comes on, and after he speaks for a while, the chorus of Asian Bacchae comes in, and they say something. And I would like you just to have the beginnings of the chorus and what Dionysus has to say, so that Euripides' Bacchae is going to begin for us next week with Dionysius coming on and individually saying something, and the chorus of the Bacchae, the wild women, as a group responding. What the individual Dionysus says and what the chorus, the Bacchae, the wild women, say ties itself in such a way that Pentheus and the other males in the Bacchae will pull at what they say, and instead of experiencing it pulling free because they pull it in such a way that the bow that is tied here, a very secret kind of a hermetic bow, that when it pulls free, it vanishes the string. But when Pentheus and the other Athenian men pull it, they pull it into a knot. And the more they pull it into a knot, the more violent they become against this, the more resentful, the more hateful. And the more that the women do not give them their support in life, in love, in existence, because it becomes deeper and deeper and deeper, like an Archimedean screw, that the deeper it goes in, the more basic it pulls out, until finally we will see that Pentheus's own mother is the one who tears him apart. Next week.